Okay, so that's got the formalities out of the way. So let's start with hands up who's seen the film Zulu. Okay, I first saw that when it came out. It shows how old I am. I went to the cinema as a little boy and was completely blown away by it. And obviously that's been a powerful image in my mind for, I don't know, 55 years or so. Unfortunately, like many Hollywood films, as you look into it, you find out that it's not quite like that. And if Zulu is one of your favourite films, I'll apologise right at the beginning because this is going to destroy it for you big time, okay? Because the only really accurate things about the film Zulu are the location, the names of the people in it, and the weather. Okay, so that's how grim it is. But hopefully, what you'll find tonight is interesting. May make you go away and research and look at some of this stuff yourself, because it is quite intriguing. And believe it or not, there are still accounts being discovered in old newspapers by men who survived the incident. So even all these years later, there's still stuff being turned up. So Zulu War started 1879 in January. It was not the brainchild of the British Empire, believe it or not. The government in the UK did not want another war, and they certainly didn't want another war anywhere in southern areas of Africa. So whose idea it was to start this whole thing? Well, Sir Bartle Frere was the politician in that area, and he teamed up with a gentleman called Lord Chelmsford, and together they came up with the idea of the Zulu War. They wanted to get it started, initiated and hopefully over within 4 weeks before the British government at home knew it had even started. That's the first big shock. This wasn't encouraged by the British government. This was started literally by two men who basically wanted to dominate the South Africa area. The main problem with dominating the South African area was this area called Zululand. Now the Zulus had been just a disparate group of tribes, but at the beginning of the 19th century they were forged together by a man called Shaka Zulu. And this guy was basically the Zulu equivalent to Napoleon. And he forged together those disparate tribes into one group, the Zulus. And it's interesting, they say history repeats itself, well it certainly does. He basically turned all those tribes into one massive confederation. His way of training his men, looking after his men, was similar to the way the Spartans operated in the ancient world. Their main battle tactic was the horns of the buffalo, which again, history repeats itself, was a similar tactic used by the Mongols in the 14th and 15th century. So Sir Bartle Frere and Lord Chelmsford decide to offer King Ketchewaya, King of Zululand, an ultimatum. Remember, they want a war. So they tell King Ketchewaya, who has got a standing army of about 25,000 Zulu warriors, to disband his army, to dismantle that which is basically the bedrock of the Zulu community. And not surprisingly, King Ketchewaya, a proud man of a powerful African nation, was backed into a corner with an ultimatum there was no way he was going to agree to. So war was declared in January 1879. There's lots of weird arrows here. This is the one you need to focus on. This is the first invasion that Lord Chelmsford starts in mid-January. As you can see, it starts at Helpmacar, goes through the area which is called Rorks Drift. There's something there called Isandlwana and an arrow pointing to about there. What's all that about? So 19th, 20th, 21st of January, Chelmsford invades Zululand, moving towards Zululand, and he wants to force a battle with Ketchewaya and his Zulus. What he does, he splits his force into 3 columns and seeks to move forward just with the sole purpose of engaging and destroying the Zulu army. Now this is where we've got to understand the mindset of your Victorian soldier, from the rank and file all the way up to generals and field marshals. There is an air of supremacy. The British Empire is all over the known world. Huge chunks of land belong to us, and we have this intense feeling of military superiority. Basically what they're thinking is, we can handle a bunch of savages. Similar attitude is found in a gentleman called George Custer, who came to a very sticky end at the Battle of Little Bighorn, who also split his command into 3 or 4 groups and was summarily slaughtered. So what happens is Chelmsford's 3 columns move in. This is the central column that Chelmsford's part of. On the 20th of January, they make camp at Sandalwana, still no sign of Zulus. So what Chelmsford does, he moves on with part of his column, so he's splitting again, leaves a camp at Sandalwana of about 14,000 men, mainly of the 24th Foot, the Warwickshire Regiment, and he moves on to seek the Zulus. The Zulus are brilliant strategists. They know how to fight war. They know how to fight war on their home turf. And basically, they flank Chelmsford's advance. And on the 22nd of January, the day starts quite badly. Chelmsford can't find anybody as he's out looking for them. That's because the Zulus have come round. And they attack the camp at Sandalwana. And in a space of 2 or 3 hours, 22,000 Zulus, not just running like lunatics, but with strategic pinpoint accuracy, attack the camp, overrun the 14,000 soldiers, slaughter them. They're not all British soldiers. There was the Natal Native Contingent, which was a localised group, and other localised military group, paramilitary groups, police paramilitary groups that were there, but almost all were slaughtered to a man, and those that managed to get away were generally guys on horseback. And it will be those guys who come into play later at Rorks Drift. So the 22nd of January is the day of the Battle of Sandalwana, and it will also be the day that the Battle of Rorks Drift takes place. Okay, do you all understand that? It's all pretty self-explanatory. Next one, Maestro. So let's have a look at the British soldier of that time. British soldier of that time is armed with the Martini Henry. It's a muzzle-loading rifle. Basically, you pull down a lever here that opens the breech, you put in a round, you pull the lever back up, it's ready to shoot. You pull the lever down, round ejects, another one goes in. So it's quite a rapid fire weapon. This guy's a sergeant, so he actually has a sword bayonet. The rank and file just had the triangular cross-section pig sticker bayonet with the same reach. Notice also that the beginnings of camouflage. This is one of the last campaigns where the red coat was in. And what is the beginnings of camouflage? They took the brass plates off the front of their helmets because they shined like crazy in the sun, and they dyed the helmets and all their white accoutrements with tea and coffee to dampen down the colour. So as you can see, the Great British Army, always so far ahead with innovation, is staining its bright white stuff with tea and coffee and removing the shiny bits from their helmets so they're not easy targets. They're going to learn a lot a few years later from the Boers. There's a water bottle there and ammo pouches at the front to take the Martini Henry round. The Martini Henry round is 0.451 in inches. And the firing of the Martini Henry, if you're nerdy enough, you can watch them being fired on YouTube. It has the kick of a mule. And it's worth remembering that later. You fire it and it really does smack into your shoulder. Okay, next one please. So now we have your Zulu warrior. Like I said, the Zulu army was arranged and it was strategically put together as clever as any other army in the world or since. How so? So Ketcheweo, he basically had his regiments, just like the British Army, and his regiments were based on age and the shield colouring. The young warriors from sort of 16, 17 up to early 20s would all live together, fight together, work together, and their shields would be predominantly dark cowhide with the odd white spot, okay? So the next age range, the white area would be bigger and the darker area would be less. And the older you got, the more white you had on your shield and the less black. So the veterans, the veteran guys, the regiments which were the older guys, and older Zulu warriors ranged between 40 and 55, and still running 20 miles a day and then fighting a battle at the end of it, were easily recognisable. So the commanders and or the king or the generals of the day could spot who the regiments were, how old they were, whether they were veterans, whether they were young guys. If it demanded a lot of lunatic running and zealous youth, they sent the boys forward with the mainly darker shields. When it came to older, wiser, meaner, more sneaky attacks, then he was looking for the guys with the predominantly white shields. Ingenious, isn't it? So that's how the Zulu regiments were. The main defensive thing was obviously the shield. That is dried cattle hide. I've seen stuff like that dried in Africa. It's pretty impressive. It starts quite disgusting, but it's really rock hard at the end of it. He's also armed with a thing called a knobkerrie, which is basically literally something about that long with a heavy wooden hardened ball at the end. You can smash a skull in with that. He has a throwing spear, which is held behind the shield, and the assegai, which is a stabbing spear. Both these spears have names in Zulu that are onomatopoeic for the sound the spear makes when it's either hitting somebody or you're pulling it out of them. Isn't that lovely, eh? Yeah. Okay, so we've got your British soldier and your Zulus with their regiments and their own way of fighting, all very unique, and you can see why they dominated the Southern African theatre of operations until the British turned up. Okay, next slide. So, Chelmsford's column has come to Isandlwana. He splits his column and goes off looking for the Zulus. While he's wandering off there looking for them, they flank him and they completely destroy the British camp at Isandlwana. Chelmsford will come back later on to find the camp completely destroyed, because obviously fugitives eventually made it to Chelmsford column. He would eventually get back to Isandlwana as the sun was going down, and it was probably good that the sun was going down. Anyone been to Africa? You know that when it gets dark in Africa, it's not like England. It doesn't take like an hour and a half. It's like a quarter of an hour. It's like getting dark, poof, it's dark. So the British Chelmsford's column came back to the camp, and the reason why it was good, because again, this was just Zulu culture. Anyone killed in battle, you didn't want their spirit to stay in their body. So the best thing you do is you open their body up so that their spirit can go. So basically, once the Zulus had killed the 1,400 men, they went to work on releasing their spirits. So basically, every single person who was killed at Isandlwana also was disemboweled as well. And that obviously fueled hatred later, but that's because there was no cultural understanding. It wasn't just brutality, it was actually a cultural, religious reason for doing that. Not sure that would please you if you knew that at the time. But anyway, so the battle takes place. Now, I talked about that bull's head thing, the horns, the main body, and the loins. The Battle of Isandlwana was for 22,000 against 1,400, but the loins of the battle formation, the older guys, they didn't get to do much fighting. In fact, they were pretty much held in reserve. And not surprisingly, when it was all over, they were pretty ticked off that they hadn't really done anything. The Zulu term was they hadn't washed their spears. So they'd gone to a battle, they were older guys, they're all up for a fight, wanted to prove, you know, going into sort of midlife crisis. So they wanted to fight, and they were really upset they hadn't. So one of their princes, whose name I won't try and pronounce, but one of their princes thought, this is not good enough, we want to fight. We want to fight. And they remembered what the Zulus called Jim's Place, Rorks Drift. The distance from Isandlwana to Rorks Drift was only 10 miles. That's just like an hour and a half, 2 hour run for Zulu army, even older guys. So there's encouragement for us older guys who are still doing fitness in the fire service. So their prince decided we will run on and we will wash our spears at Jim's Place, Rorks Drift. So that's what happened. This was all over by 2:30. As the battle was going on and the English were being defeated, there were fugitives or survivors on horseback who began to flee from the battle. And it's not a question of cowardice. If you're just seeing whole companies of men being hacked to pieces and you're on a horse, well, sometimes discretion is the better part of valor, isn't it? So fugitives start moving towards Rorks Drift, and we will see on the timeline now that Rorks Drift begins to become aware of what's happened at Isandlwana in the late afternoon. So that's what's happened on the 22nd. The destruction of the base camp there. Chelmsford's coming back, stops there for the evening. Late noon to 2:30, 3 o'clock, fugitives are beginning to turn up at Rorks Drift with some really bad news for who's at Rorks Drift. Next slide, please. So who's at Rorks Drift? Now this is where we really start destroying this film. Okay, first, Lieutenant Chard, Royal Engineer. He is down by the river and his job is to maintain the ponts that are ferrying stores and troops across into Zululand. So he's a lieutenant from the Royal Engineers. He is trained as a combat soldier, but he's really an engineer and really wants to build things and make things and do all those things that people with mechanical aptitude have. I wouldn't know because I haven't got much mechanical aptitude. Never know how I got into the fire service. Never mind. You're all wandering out in the back way as well, aren't you? Hey, there's my money man. He's bringing the money in. So Lieutenant Chard. Then Lieutenant Gonville Bromhead, known affectionately to his men as Gonny. Gonny Bromhead. Can you notice what he's doing there? So Gonny Bromhead and the guys of B Company, 1 company of the 24th Foot, the Warwickshire Regiment. Here's another myth-busting thing. It was not a Welsh regiment then. It became the South Wales Borderers a few years later. By then, this time it was the Warwickshire Regiment, and like all British Army regiments, it had its fair number of Welshmen in it and Irishmen. In fact, let's never forget that the British Empire wasn't built on English blood, it was also built on a lot of Irish, Welsh and Scottish blood. So, Gonny Bromhead is in charge of B Company, and the reason why he's left behind is because his officers said of him in accounts that they left about Lieutenant Bromhead was he was a wonderful chap, a super fellow, an excellent shot, a super boxer. He'd obviously been boxing at university, but a rubbish soldier. And he also had a hearing problem. He was going deaf. So who do you leave behind at the camp, just kicking his heels? Unfortunately, the battalion, say cripple? The most handicapped person in the battalion gets left behind with B Company. So the morning of the 22nd, the guys get up of B Company at Rorks Drift, and at that time there's about 400 people at Rorks Drift. He's in charge of B Company at Rorks Drift, he's in charge of the ponts. This is Colour Sergeant Bourne. Who remembers Colour Sergeant Bourne from the film? You know, big strapping 6'3", Nigel Green. You know, you've almost got shades of Corporal Jones. They don't like it up them, you know. Well, Colour Sergeant Bourne was known affectionately, his nickname by the guys in B Company was the Kid. The average height of soldiers in the regiment at that time was 5'3", and he was a little bit shorter. And he was known as the Kid because he was the youngest colour sergeant in the British Army. But he was dearly loved by his men. So he may have been young and inexperienced and quite a small chap, but he was very much appreciated by his men. This chap here is Acting Commissariat James Langley Dalton. Now, if you remember the film, this is the slightly effeminate chap who wanders around with a little cap on in this dark blue uniform, and at one point in the film he says, "Oh, pop that fellow," just before he gets shot. Well, that is just a complete rubbish interpretation of what James Langley Dalton was like. He was part of the Commissariat Corps, which was the embryonic logistics corps of its day. He was the only one with any combat experience. He'd done 20 plus years with the British Army. He'd been a sergeant, he'd seen combat, and he knew about fighting in the region. He'd been involved in skirmishes in the area. He'd left the British Army, joined the Commissariat Corps, and when things kicked off with the Zulu War, he got involved, and he was at Rorks Drift in charge of all the basic logistics stuff, so the store and everything else. This is Sergeant Reynolds. He's quite, in the film, he's quite a bolshy individual, quite sort of, well, just sort of bolshy sort of guy. He's sort of the anti-war part of the film. And this chap over here, he's not in the film at all. And he is probably one of the most interesting characters at Rorks Drift. He is a Reverend Chaplain George Smith. Why? Because he is 6'6" and he has a red beard like a deranged Viking, and he is basically working there with the missionary Otto Witt. You remember Jack Hawkins in the film, Otto Witt, who's pally with the Zulus, has got a rather gorgeous daughter and drinks like a fish when he can. Well, that's all rubbish. Otto Witt's children were in a village further along near a help car, and they were both very young. And Otto Witt was really pleased about the British Army coming because he wanted that area expanded so that he could then expand, hopefully, the flock of his congregation. So there's dear old Chaplain George Smith, and as you can see there, he was armed through the whole battle with a haversack. And he basically filled that haversack with ammunition and went round the perimeter, giving out ammunition to the guys and pointing out targets that they might have missed at the time. So there is one person. So these gentlemen here are all considered to be officers. They would be considered to be gentlemen. There is one missing from that, and that's a chap called Commissariat Dunn, who obviously is a buddy of Dalton. He's not there. So there you go. Just those 6 characters there show you how pretty awful the film is really of who was there on the day. So what happens is, early in the morning, Chard knows that he's got to support what's going on at Sandalwana. He actually gets on his horse. Notice he's wearing riding breeches and riding boots, not what the 24th foot guys are wearing. He gets on his horse, 8 o'clock in the morning, gallops up to his Sandalwana to get some more orders, told he's not needed, and he goes back. Isn't it fortunate that he didn't stay?
Well,
so he gets back to the Rorks Drift in his tent, which is down by the ponds, at midday, and has his lunch. Then at 2 o'clock, the actual overall commander of the area, who's in charge of all these guys, a chap called Major Spaulding, says, I'm going back to help my car. And he says one of the most classic lines of the whole of this day. He said, I won't be long. I'll be back soon. By the end of the day, you've got nothing to worry about. Nothing's going to happen. Okay, next slide. Something certainly does happen. So what we've got here is the layout. I want to talk through this quite a bit of Rorks Drift. Okay, so here is the Oscarberg mountain or hill, and as you can see, it's quite a feature. The Zulus will take up position on that hill and will shoot down on the compound. The Zulu weapons, there's a myth going around that the Zulus had weapons that they stole from the dead bodies at Sandalwana. That's not true. They had weapons that they got from traders and merchants, so some of the stuff goes back to the Napoleonic War. It wasn't that accurate, but you fire enough down into an area and eventually you're going to hit people. And that's what happened through the course of the battle. A lot of Zulu sharpshooters, in the loosest sense of the word, would take position on the Oscarberg Heights looking down. So we've got a corral here. That was a wall about that high, square in shape. We have a store here and a hospital here. So that's all that was in position when Chard is having his lunch. Bromhead and the troops back here are just dossing around, trying to stay out of the sun. It's blooming hot in Africa midday. Best thing to do, hence this expression, mad dogs and Englishmen go out in the midday sun. So they're all dossing around. So about 3 o'clock, the first fugitives from Isandlwana descend on Rorks Drift. Riders appeared distressed, upset, completely disorientated, in a state of high anxiety, and they ride in and they talk to Bromhead, Dalton and Dunn. And they are almost inconsolable. They're saying that the camp has been destroyed, everyone's been killed, and the best thing that everybody here can do is get on the road and run for help Makar. And then they ride off. Simultaneous action is going on. Fire service, we talk about simultaneous activity. Down at the river, down by the riverside, I could burst into song here. Down by the riverside, Chard sees 2 riders coming towards him. These are Natal native contingent, and one of them is a chap called Ardendorf. The other guy is based, I think he's got any boots on, his shirt is ripped, he's got no weaponry, and he's in a right state. Ardendorf stops by Chard's tent, gets off and takes charge to one side and says basically the same as what the guys who've turned up here said. The camp at San Juan has been destroyed, everyone's dead, and they're coming this way. The other guy is so distressed, he doesn't just hang around, he just heads off to help Makar. Ardendorf decides to stay. That's a gutsy thing to do when you've been witness to 14,000 people slaughtered, isn't it? Ardendorf decides to stay. Chard then gathers his group of men and they start to head back towards the camp. Here, Bromhead and Dalton and Dunn are in discussion with the news that they've received. And Bromhead initially wanted to fight the Zulus in the open. And it's here where Dalton, again, forget the film, is completely different. He's got combat experience. He says, listen, we've got a storehouse here. We've got huge mealie bags. They reckon the mealie bags weigh between 150 and 200 pounds. I mean, most of you are metric, aren't you, younger people, but that's heavy. And they had biscuit boxes. And Dalton said to Bromhead, we can make a defence of this position. We can defend this. If you go out in the open or you try and run for help, Makar, the Zulus will overtake you and they'll slaughter you. So actually the real brain box for why this action took place, you could argue the catalyst for that was Dalton. Bromhead thought about it, discussed it with Dunn. Yeah, let's do that. So remember, at this point there are 400 people on this encampment. They start using the native levies. There's quite a few native levies there, a couple of hundred native levies armed with spears like the Zulus, and they start constructing a perimeter. So initially they use the biscuit boxes and the mealie bags to create a perimeter here. They join up this section here, so they make a nice perimeter. These biscuit boxes aren't here originally. They stack up mealie bags here and they incorporate 2 wagons in the defence there just to make it easier. While this is going on, more fugitives are coming in. So now it's about 4 o'clock, 3:30, 4 o'clock. More fugitives are coming in, and a regular cavalry unit comes in with a chap called Henderson, and he says, we've come from Misandawara and they've all been slaughtered. Chard by this time has come to the post and he has said, let's build a second smaller perimeter with biscuit boxes here. So if we lose this bit, we can make a final stand here. So the levies and other guys are doing that. Chard then asks Henderson and his irregular cavalry guys if they will go out and scout ahead and let him know when the Zulus are approaching. Henderson seems to apply. They go out. I don't know how far they go out, but shots are heard and then they do a runner as well, not surprisingly. So we're getting to about 4 o'clock. Meanwhile, up on the hill, what has happened here is Surgeon Reynolds, Otto Witt and Chaplain Smith have gone up onto the Oscarberg Heights to see what they can see of what's going on in Sandrawana. They can see the smoke, they know something's gone on, and then they see a large dark mass heading towards them, and it is quite a while before they begin to wonder what's going on. As that's going on, Reynolds sees riders coming in and he's concerned that there could be wounded amongst them, so Reynolds leaves them and goes down to the mission station. When Witt and Chaplain Smith realise that large dark cloud coming towards them is actually Zeus, they very rapidly head back to the mission station, which is now fortified like this. Okay, so the store is a proper building. The hospital is a proper building. That is actually Witt's main home. When Witt comes down and sees that what they're doing here is they're smacking loopholes in the walls. In the hospital, they're also smacking loopholes in the wall for men to shoot through. Now, he's upset by that because this is actually his home. And it's at this point Otto Witt thinks, no, I'm not having this. The Zulus are coming and they're destroying my home. I'm a non-combatant. I have a wife and children, 2 children further on down. He decides to leave. Chaplain Smith goes to see if his horse is there. Someone's taken his horse. There are other horses there, but he just feels that it's divine providence that he should stay, so he chooses to stay. What happens now is, with all the trauma and excitement and hysteria that has been coming from Isandlwana with the various fugitive groups coming in, the native levy decides to do a run. There are various groups over a period of about an hour that do a runner and rush off to help Makar. Cut a long story short, Chard and Bromhead's 400 possible combatants is reduced to 155, 35 of which are in the hospital and have a wound of some description. That's quite depressing, isn't it? So it's getting on towards 4:30 now. What happens is, Chard asks a gentleman called Private Hitch to get up on the storeroom to look out to see if he can see the Zulus approaching. About 4:30, 4:45, Hitch says he can see them coming. He shouts down to Chard. Chard asks him how many. He says 4,000 to 6,000 Zulus. 150 guys, 153, 54, 55 guys, and it turns out to be nearer 4,000 Zulus are coming this way. Just stop for a minute and think how that would make you feel on the day. You've seen people running, you've seen panic spread, you've seen your numbers reduced by drastic amounts, and you know an unbelievable amount of the enemy are coming towards you. And from what the people who've come to you have said, it's bad news if they win for you on a whole different series of levels. A couple of things I want to point out now. There's a rocky ledge here that the mealie bags and biscuit boxes were built on top of, and that ledge, there was like a 4 to 5 foot drop. So the combined height from ground level to the top of there was nearer 9 foot. So that was actually quite a deep area beyond the perimeter there. There was a sloping ledge there. This was a bit of a weak spot, and there was also a little bit of a weak spot there that we'll come to later. So what happens is the Zulus start attacking, and like any tactical advance to contact, they don't all come swarming in. 400 or 500 start coming in from this direction, and they seem to be coming to attack this section of the perimeter. So from now on, that's the north, okay? That's the north wall, that's the south wall, that is obviously the east, and that is the west wall. Chard has designated six soldiers to defend the hospital, as well as arming some of those men in the hospital who weren't so sick that they couldn't be armed. And the 6 men in the hospitals, this is the way I remember it, on the west wing you've got 2 W's, 2 Williamses, that's the Welsh part. There's Joseph Williams and John Williams here. There is Private Hook here, and he is with Private Cole. This is another terrible, the family, the Hook family, I think they took out legal action after seeing Zulu. I think that's right, you can Google that, I might be wrong. But they were disgusted with the way Hook was portrayed in the film. Who can remember Hook in the film? Drunkard, malingerer, scrounger, womanizer. Henry Hook was a Christian, a Methodist, and a teetotaler. And he was the cook. And that morning he had spent most of his time getting tea together and biscuits for the guys in the hospital. Well, he was in this room here with Cole, and over here, we'll see the layout a bit later, you've got 2 more Welsh names, you've got 2 Joneses, okay? I'll say Tom, but that's someone different. Their names will come to me later. So 2 Williamses here, Hook and Cole here, 2 Joneses here, and groups of wounded soldiers, some of which can fight in the other ends. You'll see the layout of that later, we'll get to that later. So, the battle is about to start. Does anybody need a break? No? Okay. Let me just have a piece of water. The first Zulu wave starts attacking the south side of the perimeter. Private Hitch has got down off the storehouse, and he joins the guys on the back row here. A lot of them are sharpshooters, and they start opening fire. The initial 500 or 600 Zulus that attack the rear of or the south side of the perimeter The Martini Henry will stop a man at 600 yards, but even sharpshooters aren't hitting what they're aiming at until they're 500 yards. Initially, there are not many Zulus being taken down, but eventually they are being taken down at a rapid rate of fire. So remember, there are loopholes in the storehouse. Ardendorf is in this storehouse. He's taken up position here. Obviously, the Joneses have loopholed here and here. They've got doors and windows they can shoot through. Hook and Cole also. At the moment, the Williamses can't shoot much because they're facing west. The 400 Zulus come on. The fire is pretty intense. They seem to like they're going to make it to the barricade, and finally they begin to sweep round this way, and they take up refuge in the area around the cookhouse and storehouse, and those with weapons start shooting. It looked like that wave was going to make it to the barricade, but they didn't. Part of the wave then moves round and attacks the west side of the hospital. What happens then is more of the Zulus come into battle, and they are released into the battle. The battle is now well underway by 4:45. They're continuing to fight and shoot and pot shot from this side. The Zulus and here are shooting down into that part. First initial casualties are taking place. More Zulus are coming in and they're attacking the west end of the hospital. Problem with the hospital, and if you've ever been to Africa, this is worth taking note of now. Most African buildings built by the indigenous people are mud bricks. They make bricks out of mud, lay them out in the sun, bake them dry, and they build with that. So it's good, strong stuff, but when you want to hack at it, you can. So the loophole's really easily made, and that will come into play later. But this was Jim Rorks originally built this place, and he wanted a residence where he could put guests, but he could put guests that wouldn't interfere with his life. So some of the rooms, we'll see them later, their only doors face outwards, which is great if you've got guests you don't want to spend a lot of time with. But it's a real pain in the bottom when you're trying to defend somewhere. So there's no connecting doors, the only doors open outwards. And guess what Zulu guys are really good at? Hacking through doors. So the attack is here. It's now here, and as more of the 4,000 Zulus are coming into being played and being released by their generals, they start moving around to the front. At no point during Rorks Drift was all four sides attacked at once, and these things are done in waves. There is simultaneous activity, but by this time this attack is beginning to die down as these attacks begin to intensify. What's happening now is the Zulus are beginning to force this area here. Ooh. Force this area here. They begin to attack this with such ferocity that Bromhead gathers together a small group of men to support the guys on that wall. Bromhead, Hitch and about half a dozen other guys then get up position here just as the Zulus are beginning to push the guys here back, and they begin to get over the perimeter and start coming into this area. At that point, Gonny Bromhead leads his first bayonet charge, and over the next half hour or so he will lead at least half a dozen of those bayonet charges. There will be people firing from the front of the hospital, guys fighting in here, and by this point, once the bayonet charges are coming in to clear the Zulus who've got over the barrier, it's hand-to-hand combat, it's face-to-face, and you can see into the eyes and smell the person you're killing. It's brutal stuff, it's the stuff of medieval and ancient warfare. But that's how things were going as the battle began to heat up. Okay, so this goes on for approximately 45 minutes, an hour, and by the time we get to 6 o'clock, Chard is beginning to realise that this is the weak part of the perimeter. He can't keep supplying these bayonet charges. Casualties are beginning to mount. People are getting shot. Some people are getting hit by assegais. By 6 o'clock, Chard has to come to the gut-wrenching decision that he is going to have to withdraw from this area and make this his final perimeter. What does that leave the people in the hospital? That leaves them out on their own. Okay, next slide. So now we go to the fight at the hospital. This is from the lecture I first did about 14 years ago. Some of it's wrong. Some of it's wrong. Up here, these guys aren't here. Up here we've got Waters and Beckett are in this room. These guys are in. So a chap called Waters and a chap called Beckett are in this room. Everything else is pretty much right. So here are the Joneses, okay? Robert and William Jones. Obviously they got a window door. Most of you are familiar with how this is. So don't be confused. This is a veranda, okay? So that's open. You've got 10 rooms. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 rooms, sorry. And here are the rooms that open outwards. One there. There's more. One there. And there should be one somewhere else. So those are the rooms that open outwards. As you can see, bad news for the Williams brothers. They're not brothers, but we'll just call them that for now. And as you can see, there are names of the various injured guys with them. So as Chard withdraws to that final perimeter, he leaves these guys fighting. Let's start with the Williamses. So the Williamses are doing their best to keep the Zulus out of that room. They've got wounded guys in that room. The Zulus begin to hack through the door. Joseph Williams does his best to keep them at bay, bayoneting and shooting as many as he possibly can. John Williams begins to realise that they are stuck in that room, and if the Zulus get in, they're going to all get slaughtered. So he then uses his bayonet and starts hacking away. That's why I talked about mud brick. It's not like concrete brick. If you hit it hard enough, you'll start to crack away. So Williams is feverishly hacking at the wall and he mouse holes. It's a modern military term for making a hole into another room. He mouse holes into this room. As he's doing that, Joseph Williams is being attacked more and more. He's doing his absolute best. Williams gets Beckett through the hole. Williams is looking around. Just at that point, somehow, they're not sure exactly what happened, whether Joseph Williams actually went out to fight the Zulus or they dragged him out. Either way, Williams ends up outside there fighting to save his life. It's obviously a battle you're not going to win. And he basically gets hacked to bits and then disemboweled out here somewhere. Williams and Beckett are through. The rest of the guys in the room are summarily slaughtered. While this is going on, Hook is doing his best, firing and fighting from the window and the door. Cole has actually left at this point and joined the fighting at the front. We don't know why he did that. There must have been some lull at some point where Cole thought he would do more good out the front. He runs out the front and joins the fighting at the front and ends up getting shot through the head. Should have stayed where he was, shouldn't he? Vital yes, vital advice for those of us who like to freelance at jobs. Stay where your officer has told you to stay. Remember that, Ron. Okay, so Cole has gone. There is a native in that room, and Hook begins to realise that he cannot hold on to that room much longer on his own. So unfortunately, again, racial superiority kicks into play. Hook leaves the native and goes into the next room to defend that. Williams and Beckett have come through to join them. At this point, the Zulus are trying to set fire to the roof. I won't mention the TH word, because I know how superstitious some of you are. But because the thatch, because the thatch is damp, it takes a long time to catch fire, but it will eventually catch fire. So I told you that we've got Waters and what was the other guy? Well, Waters is up there with another guy, and they are shooting at the Zulus that are making it onto the veranda, because remember, at this point, the hospital's been left to fight for itself. Over here, the Joneses, most of the defenders of the hospital are beginning to run out of ammunition. Simultaneous action, Surgeon Reynolds, who is very much aware that these people are his responsibility. Can you go back that way? Surgeon Reynolds is obviously here in this part. This is now a no man's land. Surgeon Reynolds decides they must be running out of ammunition. Maybe you can hear the amount of fire decreasing. Sergeant Reynolds loads up his arms and his pockets with ammunition, runs across no man's land and starts, there's a window there, I think you see it on the previous one, and starts handing ammunition through to the Joneses. Again, that's no man's land. The guys at the biscuits boxes are desperately trying to cover Sergeant Reynolds as he makes that dash to get ammunition to the boys. So back again. So the Joneses are fighting like crazy. They've got various people. Probably the most famous one that you will know for the film is Sergeant Maxfield. Sergeant Maxfield, the guy who's in the bed delirious, keeps shouting at Hook, "Oh, make a soldier of you yet, Hook." All rubbish. But he was in a very bad way, delirious, suffering from all sorts of horrible things. They're in that room. So the Joneses are trying to defend them, and then they realise that they cannot hold this area much longer, so they start to withdraw with the idea of evacuating the prisoners through this window here. This window is about 8 foot up, so it's quite high up, so people have got to be lowered down. So the Joneses desperately defend this area, while the wounded, he's not mentioned there, like I say, this is an old map, but a trooper called Roy, who was also injured, who would later get a medal, not a VC, helped one of the Joneses lower the prisoners. The first prisoner out, the first patient out, unfortunately a Zulu saw him, leapt over the barricade, ran at him, and assegaied him just as he was being shot by that guy with a revolver. Both ended up dropping on the floor dead. So it's not always the best thing to be the first out. The following casualties were covered by the fire from the guys back at the biscuit boxes. Guys ran out to help them. Corporal Allen went out to help them. Sergeant Reynolds went out to help them to get across no man's land back to the biscuit box. The Joneses eventually realised they'd done their stuff, they'd done what they could, and they made their way back to the biscuit boxes, to the final perimeter. That's the first evacuation. First time I did this, I thought it all happened at once. No, there were 2 specific evacuations. That's the first lot. So basically, this side has gone. Now we've got Hook with Williams in this room. And as you can see, we've got Zulus here, we've got Zulus here, and there's some mouse holding that needs to be done. Williams now, he's gone up in the world. He's got a Navis pick. There is a Navis pick in that room, so instead of using his bayonet, he's hacking away at that wall. Later, his hands will be red raw. It shows you how being threatened with death and disembowelment can speed up your desire to hack through a mud wall. So he's hacking away. Hook is desperately trying to defend that area. As they finally make a hole into there and they start getting into there, they lose a man. They're not quite sure which man is lost, can't remember his name. And then they move into that room. When they get into that room, Williams again is hacking at that wall, and Hook is desperately trying to defend that area. While they are making the transfer from that room to that room, Hook hears the native in there being interrogated by the Zulus who've broken into that room and then summarily executed. Eventually they all move into that room. The process continues until they finally get to that room, and now we get to the second evacuation. The only problem is, when Williams gets his guys to that window, Hook is left the last man in the building with one other. Maxfield has been slaughtered by then. Connolly, years ago, many years ago, when I was a young fireman, we used to do carry-downs, and you would always find somebody the same height as you. The only trouble is, those days I was a 10.5 stone racing snake, and I always ended up somebody the same height as me who weighed 15 stone. Well, this was the case for Hook. He was left with this chap called Connolly, who was a big man. Now, Hook was not necessarily very big, so he's left alone. Almost everyone's out. He's left with Connolly, who has got a horrendous leg wound from one of these car accidents. His whole knee is displaced. He's in terrible agony. He drags him into there. By now, the roof has caught fire well, so the whole building is filling up with smoke. That's why the Zulus are beginning to leave this area. They're not interested anymore. There isn't much fire coming from there. They think the whole building is going to burn down. But Hook realises there's no way he's getting Connolly through there. So there does appear to have been another window there. So Hook manages to push, shove and thump Connolly through there. Actually, the other side of the barricade. And thankfully, they managed to get over the melee bags, get him over the melee bags. And Connolly is taken into the final perimeter. And Hook is the last man out of the hospital and into the final perimeter. Meanwhile, 2 chaps here do a runner, and they just run straight out over the barricade, collapse into the undergrowth and play dead. Unfortunately, as one of them's doing that, he gets assegaied in the stomach. Beckett and Waters, that's it, Beckett and Waters. So they're out in Zululand playing dead. Okay, next slide please. Everyone all right? No one asleep yet? So now, we've got the final perimeter. Notice please where the water cart is. I think a BA wears dehydrating. Imagine fighting for hours on end. So now the final perimeter. The rough corral has been, the Zulus are using that for cover. We've got the final perimeter. It was about 6:30 or so that Chard, simultaneous action, realised he needed a final perimeter, and he got together with Commissariat Dunn and said, I want a redoubt built here to make a last stand. So another, this chap, Commissariat Dunn, again, built a redoubt while all this fighting and shooting's going on under constant fire. He builds a redoubt there that was about, I think it was 9 feet, 10 feet, 9 feet high, with a firing step on the inside, a very small entrance that the moment everyone withdrew into could be plugged, and that was there for the final stand. So here we have what will be the final perimeter. As you can see, this no man's land, the Zulus have access to all of that. The storehouse has been loopholed. So basically, this is a time when there is almost all-round attacks because the perimeter has shrinked rapidly. Time now is about 7:30, 8 o'clock. The hospital roof is well alight and it's beginning to get dark, and like I said, within 15 minutes it will be very dark. But as we all know, those of us who are firemen, where there's fire, there's light. So the catching fire of the roof actually provided light for the defenders to attack the Zulus with their bullets as well as their bayonets. Okay, next slide please. So, positions in the final perimeter. Eventually that corral would be given over to the Zulus and this part of the wall would be defended. There's the redoubt. What happens from like 7:30 till midnight? The first thing that we could talk about is Commissariat Dalton. All through the battle, this guy has been armed with a Martini Henry and a bayonet. He's been leading small groups of men to repulse the Zulus, not just with bullet but with bayonet. He's been a great source of inspiration. At one point earlier on in the battle, he got so angry with the Zulus, he stood up on a parapet and threw his helmet at them, which was very jingoistic and gung-ho, but that did an awful lot for morale. I'm sure he got himself another helmet fairly quickly. Commissariat Dalton is suddenly aware that he's about to shoot one Zulu and another one's got the bead on him, and before he can say anything, pop, that fellow comes out of his mouth like in the film, but in a completely different context, and he gets shot through the shoulder, and it's a through and through. I'm sure we can all work out what that means, and he collapses to the floor. He heads back to where Dr. Reynolds has set up a casualty clearing place, doing minor surgery and patching up wounds. It's not long before, even though the bullet has gone through his shoulder, he gets patched up, returns to the perimeter and starts giving out ammunition. Also at this time, the effects of the Zulu rifles are becoming more of a problem. Lance Sergeant Williams gets shot through the chest, Private Chick gets shot through the chest, Private Scanlon gets shot through the head, Private Fagan gets shot through the gut. Most of the fatalities will be caused by bullet wounds at this point. There's Ardendorf fighting from the rear of the store with Corporal Atwood and Sergeant Milne. Private Hitch is working with the guys in this corner. This ended up being the most dangerous part of the final perimeter. Bromhead manned that part of the perimeter with Hitch and 4 other soldiers, including a sergeant, Sergeant Williams. Sergeant Williams got shot through the chest, mortally wounded. Another private got shot through the head. Another private got shot through the head. Another private got shot through the neck. Only Bromhead survived. Hitch then got shot through the shoulder. As it went out through his shoulder blade, it completely shattered his shoulder blade and they basically picked his shoulder blade out of the whole of his body in the following days. Hitch then retires to Reynolds. Reynolds patches him up. He's feeling a lot better. He decides to go back to the fight. He comes alongside a Bromhead. Forgot to mention this earlier. Most of the officers like Bromhead, Chard, Reynolds and Dunn would have, and obviously Surgeon Reynolds would have been armed with revolvers. Bromhead gives Hitch the revolver, so Hitch starts taking pot shots at the Zulus with a revolver until finally the nature of his wound is so bad he collapses and they drag him into the redoubt and he passes unconscious in there. At the same time this is going on, the Zulus are constantly charging this area, and obviously Corporal Sheese in this area, he's with an Italian now native contingent. He's been shot through the foot in the withdrawal to the final perimeter, and he's really, really upset about this. He's seen all these guys with head wounds and other wounds, and he thinks, I'm not having this, because he realises what the Zulus are using is they're using the other side of the rampart here as a place to hide and pop up and shoot. So what would any sensible person do in that situation? He decides to go over where the Zulus are, and he shimmies along the parapet, and when he's aware that there are Zulus the other side, he leaps up on the parapet, shoots one, bayonets one, and then bayonets another, and thinks, well, that will keep them quiet for a while, and then he hobbles back over the barricade. You won't be surprised later what happens with Corporal Sheese. While this is going on, the Zulu attacks are beginning to peter out. Remember, the battle starts about 5 o'clock, and we are getting towards about 10:30 now. They've run approximately 20 miles, including the run to Isandlwana that day. Then they've run to Rorks Drift, combined distance of about 20 miles. They're not young guys, they haven't eaten. The only help they've had for the battle is the Zulus like taking snuff before a battle, not particularly hallucinogenic snuff. Anybody here old enough to have tried snuff? I think I tried it once and sneezed for about 3 days. As we get towards midnight, the battle is finally winding down. The light of the burning thatch is beginning to go. The Zulu attacks are wearing completely down to non-existent. There are odd pot shots. And as we go into the early hours of the morning, Chard and Bromhead said, let's go and get the water wagon. I think we can risk it. The store is down to 900 rounds of bullets for the Martini Henrys. They started, I think I'm right, with 20,000, and we're down to 900. Finally, the sun comes up. Practically no aggravation from the Zulus as the sun was coming up. About 6 o'clock, a large body of Zulus was seen on one of the nearby hills. A bit later, another group was seen. They did stand to, thinking they were going to attack again, but they didn't. There was no singing, there was no Menahale, there was no glorious wave from the Zulus. They just staggered off exhausted. Those who survived began to think about moving out. It was at this point Beckett, Waters and Beckett staggered in. Guys probably couldn't believe they were alive, and that was a time of great rejoicing to see two men who thought were long dead coming back. And the British soldiers who were left began to refresh themselves, cope with the stress and trauma what they'd gone through, and then they went out to the surrounding area. And at 8 o'clock, Chelmsford obviously had gone through the night, and Chelmsford had come to relieve Rorks Drift with what was left of his column, and Chelmsford's column turned up, and there was a time of much rejoicing and celebration. And that is how the Battle of Rorks Drift ended. Final picture, please. There are two famous paintings of Rorks Drift that you see in any book with Rorks Drift. One painted by Alphonse de Neuville, which I've got in my landing at home. I was going to bring it in, but it was just...
the original?
Yeah, if only. And another famous battle painter was a lady, Lady Butler, and she painted this. And both Alphonse de Neuville and Lady Butler had survivors help them with their painting. So this is Lady Butler's painting. Who can tell me who they think that is?
Well, guessing that.
Michael Caine?
No, close. That's Hitch. Shoulder wound, giving out ammo. Come on, you've got to get better than this.
Oh, yeah.
Right, I'll give you a clue. Who's this chap looking after the wounded guy?
Well, I've been Doctor.
Surgeon Reynolds. Who's the chap wearing riding breeches?
Mr. Braun.
Chard, yeah? So that's obviously got to be... Who's the guy, the giant with the big red beard? Chaplin.
Big Chaplin.
Yeah, Smith. That's Dalton, wounded. That's Sheese. That's one of the Joneses. I think that's the other Jones. This painting was Queen Victoria's favourite painting. She had some of the survivors come and talk to her after dinner one night and talked about all that happened. And she took a shine to one of the Joneses. Because his story in the hospital really affected her. Let me just finish by saying one thing. The Martini Henry was fired so much by the men through the night that the barrels began to glow. They had to rip off bits of their haversack or even their own tunics or the tunics of the dead to wrap around their hands because the muzzles and the breech loading areas was burning them. They were firing so much and the recoil of the Martini Henry was so bad in the last stages of the battle they couldn't bear to hold it against their shoulder. They were actually holding their guns away from their bodies to fire them. Many of the men the next day had one side of their faces slightly burnt because it was still black powder and the constant heat coming from the chamber had affected them, and most of them one side of their upper torso was really badly bruised. But in the words of Monty Python, compared to many of those, it was just a mere flesh wound. Okay, let me just read you the final part. Okay. I wish I could do my Richard Burton voice here, but it would probably sound more like Dame Edna Everidge. Victoria Crosses won at Rorks Drift. Lieutenant John Rouse Marriott Chard, Royal Engineers. 24th 2nd Battalion, Warwickshire Regiment, Victoria Crosses to Gonville Bromhead, Corporal Allen, Private Hitch, Private Hook, Private Jones, Private William Jones, Private John Williams. Victoria Cross Army Hospital Corps, Sergeant James Henry Reynolds. Victoria Cross Commissariat and Transport Department, Assistant Commissariat Officer James Langley Dalton. Natal Native Contingent, Victoria Cross, Corporal Ferdinand Christian Sheese. Distinguished Conduct Medal, Colour Sergeant Braun. Hooray! Private William Roy, Gunner John Cantwell of the Royal Horse Artillery, and Army Service Corps, Corporal Francis Atwood. There were 27 casualties, 17 fatalities, most of those were bullet wounds or died of wounds later. That, my friends, is the Battle of Rorks Drift. And as you can see, as we've gone through it, if ever there was a film that could do with a remake, it's Rorks Drift. And not just from the bravery from the British soldiers, but what the Zulus did on that day. It's not revisionism. It was incredibly brave what they did. It was interesting that survivors all said that the Zulus were not afraid of being shot, but what they did seem to be scared of was the bayonet. And the fact that they didn't actually get over the perimeter in any vast numbers was what saved Rorks Drift. And Chard's idea of having a shrinking perimeter was also a very important part of the battle. One final thing is, King Kechewayo had given orders to his general as the war started and said two things. Whatever you do, do not attack the English, he called them the English, the English in fortifications, and do not attack them at night. Most of the Battle of Rorks Drift happened at night. So there you go. Thank you very much, one and all.
Thank you.